to make things a little more personal, hopefully. So welcome, everybody. My name is Marty Mascari. I am with the North Central Texas Area Agency on Aging and the North Central Texas Aging and Disability Resource Center. I'm a contractor with both of them. Both of them are under the umbrella of the North Central Texas Council of Governments and covers the greater Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas area. We are blessed once again here to have our partners at the North Texas Fair Housing Center, namely Francis Espinoza here to talk to us about why a written lease is so important and what and how it protects you. But before we get started, we're going to talk, we're going to just kind of go over the guidelines for certificates of attendance and the certificates, CEU certificates, if we could. So for those of you that are joining us today, that are looking for certificates of attendance or CEUs, we are set up today to provide CEUs for licensed social workers and licensed professional counselors in the state of Texas. That's who we're set up with. If you have a different license in Texas or a license outside of Texas, you're more than welcome to go through the process, get a certificate, and submit it to the jurisdiction you're required to do CEUs with. But whether they take it or not is really up to them, and we have no control over that. So I just want to make sure you know that up front, but you're more than welcome to go through the process and get the certificate. The guidelines for CEUs and for certificates of attendance are the same. Today's webinar is worth 1.5 hours of CE credits. You must complete the entire webinar in order to qualify. And you must also attend the Q&A. You must complete the Google survey, evaluation survey. You should have a pop-up that gives you the option to go to that as you close out of Zoom today. But if you don't get that, and some companies have pop-up blockers, there are all sorts of technical reasons why you might not get that. But if you don't get that, I'm going to email that out to you in a follow-up email as well. The link, along with the link to the slides for today's presentation. Just so you know, I just put the slides in the chat. If you missed them on the email this morning, you should you can go ahead and access them to the link I put in the chat. In order to qualify for the CEUs, you must complete the evaluation before 7/7. I gave an extra day because of the holiday, before the July the 7th. And then give me about 3 weeks after that to get those out to you. And I'm constantly back and forth between getting caught up and getting behind, but we will definitely get those out to you. So I'm going to turn it over to Francis Espinoza to talk to us today about why the written lease is important. Francis, it's all yours.
Thank you, Marty. So as Marty said, my name is Francis Espinoza, and I'm the Executive Director of the North Texas Fair Housing Center. And today I want to highlight some terms within a lease that you should really look for when you sign a lease, and read through those before you sign. And just, right off the top, I want to say that a lease is a contract. It's a very important document. And because Texas doesn't have a lot of laws that guide the landlord-tenant relationship, the lease is really something, it's really very important, because when you have questions about things like repairs or, pest control or, trash fees, things like that, you really have to look back to your lease document most times to find out what the rules are at your particular apartment or rental. Because the state of Texas really doesn't have much on the books for those types of issues. Okay, so like I said, it's a general leases are a binding contract. So when you sign up for that, when you sign them, you have to abide by all the terms, including the number of months that you've signed the lease for. And typically those are typically leases are signed for 12 months for a year, but sometimes they'll let you sign a lease for less than 12 months at a premium, meaning you have to pay more monthly in monthly rent. And sometimes I've seen apartments have offer an 18-month lease, And a lot of times those are offered at a little bit of a discount to the monthly rent. And the reason why housing providers want you to sign a lease is so that they know what their income is going to be. You know, if they lock you into 12 months, they know they don't have to worry about that apartment for 12 months. For 12 months, they're going to have X amount of dollars in rent coming into them for that apartment. So they prefer not to do month-to-month tenancies. And a lot of times when you, after you finish your lease term, they'll want you to sign up for another lease term. But sometimes they do offer 2 different rental amounts. So at 12 months, it'll be this rent amount, which is typically lower than if you want to go month to month. Because again, they're charging a premium for you to go month to month because they don't know how long you're going to stay. So one of the big things that happen one of the topics that we get called about all the time is folks who have seen an apartment or a rental and there's things that need to be done. Maybe it's really dirty or it needs to be painted or the carpet needs to be changed out. And the housing provider or leasing agent, whoever, will tell them, oh, that's going to be done before you move in. And then what happens on the day they are moving all their things in, they arrive at the apartment and none of that's been done. So I want to caution everybody not to sign a lease based on a promise. You know, you want to see, if at all possible, I know a lot of apartments show, what do they call those, model units? But, you know, if at all possible, see the unit that you are going to move into. And if there are things that need to be done, don't sign the lease on the promise that those repairs or whatever are going to be made. So make sure it's in the condition that you want it to be when you move in. Okay, so late fees are something that's always outlined in the lease. And so this is something that you should look for, this line item, before you sign a lease. Don't assume that you have a grace period. Most typically you will have between the 1st and the 3rd to pay rent without a late fee, but double check that, because you know some apartments are now charging, if you don't pay on or before the 1st, they'll charge you a late fee. So make sure that you read that and it's very clear and that you understand what the late fees are. Some apartments will have a lump sum late fee, no matter how late you are, and some have a daily late fee. So you might have from the 1st to the 3rd to pay your rent, but if you don't pay it in that time frame, there might be a $25 charge every day after that, and those can accumulate. And so you want to read through that and make sure that you understand what those terms are. So there, surprisingly, Texas a few years ago, the state did pass a law regarding late fees, because there was nothing, there were no rules related to late fees, and a lot of housing providers were charging late fees that were really high. And so now buildings with 4 units or less can't charge a late fee that's more than 12% of the rent. And buildings with 4 units, more than 4 units, can't exceed 10% of the rent. So, you know, these limits on late fees are going to be different based on what your monthly rent is, but you can do the math and find out what the maximum late fee would be. And so this would limit those, the places that have daily late fees. They can keep doing a daily late fee, but for the larger buildings, which are more than 4 units, they can't exceed 10%. So at a certain point, it's going to hit that limit, and then they're not going to be able to charge after that. So make sure that you know your rights related to those things, because, you know, especially at those properties that charge daily late fees, because they can't do that forever. Once they hit that 10% or 12%, depending on how big the building is, then they have to stop that late fee. Okay, so another thing that the lease is going to give you information on, and that you should, you should find this term before you sign a lease. It's really important because, like I said, a lease is a contract, and so you're legally bound to that. But there always is a provision in a lease that states what the penalty will be if you want to end it early. So if you want to move out before the term expires, there's probably going to be a penalty that's going to be, typically it's about 2 months rent. And, depending on what your rent is, that could be a lot. And then they'll also charge you what they call a reletting fee, which is typically it's on average about $150, and that's on top of the penalty. So if your housing provider, we have people call us all the time that say, well, I have something on my credit report that I just found out about, and it's from a rental I had a couple of years ago. And they wanted to move out early. So they told the, whoever management company, whoever, I need to move out early. And the housing provider said, fine, okay, move out early. And didn't get it in writing that it would be without a penalty or a fee. The person didn't pay any penalties or fees, just packed up and left. And then they check their credit, they don't realize that on their credit report. They find out a couple of months or a year or 2 years later that they have this outstanding debt on their credit report. And so typically housing providers are not going to let you out of your lease early without paying a fee or a penalty. So if they do agree to allow you to do that, then get that in writing from them, because you will need that if something pops up on your credit report, a year later, for example. You want to have that signed letter so that you can get the credit reporting agencies to take that off of your record. There are a few reasons in Texas that will allow you to terminate your lease early. And those are issues related to the Fair Housing Act or housing discrimination. So, for example, one of them is if you're a person with a disability and you need to terminate your lease early due to your disability. So an example could be somebody who lives on the second floor of a 2-story building with no elevators. Maybe when they moved in, they didn't have a disability. Now they do. And they can't negotiate the stairs. So they can ask to terminate their lease early without a fee or penalty so that they can find an accessible unit. But with accommodations law, it's all about what's reasonable. So if that particular apartment has a unit available on the first floor, then that may be more reasonable than just completely terminating a lease. And if a housing provider offers that, that's probably the alternative to what that's probably something the person will have to accept. If they don't have any available apartments that are on the first floor, then terminating the lease early at that particular property so they could find an accessible unit might be the most reasonable. The other exception to not having to pay a fee or penalty if you terminate your lease early is due to domestic violence. So victims of domestic violence. So for example, if somebody has lived in an apartment, they signed a lease, they're maybe 7 months into their lease, and then their former abuser finds out where they live and comes onto the property. And now the former victim of domestic violence doesn't feel safe at that property anymore because her abuser found out where she lived and is harassing her or comes on property. That person the former victim of domestic violence can request to terminate their lease early without any fees or penalties based on the fact that their abuser found out where they live and they don't feel safe anymore. They can do that under the Fair Housing Act. There's also a property code in Texas that speaks to that issue. And so there are different provisions different things the person needs to be able to show in order to use that property code in Texas. And then there's also the Violence Against Women Act, which typically that is going to be the best thing to use if the person lives in public housing and is a victim of domestic violence and needs to terminate their lease early or move to another apartment, another public housing apartment transfer, for example. Okay, so let's do a little quiz and you can put your answers in the chat. So which of the following do you think is an example of an acceptable rental practice? So there might be more than one answer. Is it A, the unit a tenant is going to rent is occupied, the landlord shows a model bedroom that is exactly like the unit, so the tenant signs the lease? B, the landlord wants to implement a late fee of 15% of the rent when the lease expires? C, tenant is asked to pay an additional admin fee after the lease has been signed. Or D, the landlord allows a tenant to move out before the lease term expires, but charges them a fee for reletting. So which of the following are acceptable rental practices? Okay, so we have a lot of people saying D. Okay, so D is one of the correct answers. The landlord allows a tenant to move out before the lease term expires, but charges them a fee for reletting. So that's a perfectly acceptable rental practice. The other one is actually A, because that is an acceptable rental practice if a unit is occupied for the landlord to show like a model unit. That isn't ideal though. So, you know, again, if you can if it's at all possible for you to see the unit that you're going to rent, you want to do that. But it is an acceptable practice to show you a unit that's at the exact same layout or the exact same number of bedrooms. Okay, B and C are not acceptable practices. B actually violates the Texas property code. And C, that's just seems a little shady because once you've signed the lease, you shouldn't have to pay an additional admin fee. That raises red flags. Okay, so let's talk about utilities because utilities should also be outlined in the lease. And now I think it's becoming more common that tenants are going to be, that the cost of utilities are going to be passed along to the tenant. So it should say that in your lease document, and it should talk about how, it should state how you're going to be charged. There are some older apartments that may have 1 meter, for example, for electricity, and the housing provider decides how they're going to divide that among the tenants. And that may be divided by the number of bedrooms, or it may be divided by the number of tenants in a unit. If it's done by bedrooms, for example, people who live in 2-bedroom units will pay more than people who live in 1-bedroom units. If it's based on the number of occupants, somebody with 4 occupants, of course, is going to pay a higher utility electric bill than somebody with an apartment with 2 occupants. And then there are the newer apartments that are being built have their own meters. And so it should say in the lease that you have to, you know, get the meter open or get the electric service opened in your name. So the other things that you could be charged for are a monthly trash fee, sewage fee, water fee, electricity, which I already talked about. But all of this should be outlined in your lease. And, you know, we always get people calling us where they are upset that their utilities have changed from month to month, but that's pretty typical, you know, and if there's a surge or like, for example, in the summer, your utilities are going to be a lot higher and that should be expected. But make sure you understand what the policy is for that particular property as far as what your utilities, what you're responsible for and how they're going to be charged to you. Your lease should also talk about transfer fees if you want to move to another apartment within the same building. If you need to, and transfer fees are completely legal. The only exception is if you need to transfer to a different unit due to a disability, then you can ask for a reasonable accommodation, and that transfer fee should be waived. And pets. So with your lease document, there are now several addendums that apartments have added to leases. Pets is one of them. So in the body of your lease, it'll talk about what the pet deposit is if you have a pet, for example, and then there'll be an addendum, which is just a single sheet added to the lease that kind of outlines what the fees are, and they might even request like your breed of dog or the dog's name or cat's name or whatever. So to charge a pet deposit or pet rent is perfectly legal. Some apartments just charge an initial deposit, $250, $300 if you want to have a pet on property. And it could be doubled if you have 2 pets. And some charge a lower pet deposit, so maybe $100 or $150, but they charge $25 a month additional rent for your pet. And both of those are perfectly legal. Now, if you have an emotional support animal as a person with a disability, you can request an accommodation, and with that accommodation, you should get a waiver from any pet rent or pet deposit. Pest control. This is another really good one because we have a lot of, it seems like there's a need for pest control in a lot of apartment buildings. And this is, again, something that your lease should talk about. So refer back to the lease if you want to find out more about the pest control. Some apartments have just a monthly fee that you have to pay, and that will cover any pest control at the building or in your unit. And what we've seen more and more of is there's now an addendum for bed bugs. And so some apartments now have put an addendum in the lease, so which again, it's another sheet of paper, maybe a couple of pages, that is added to the lease that specifically talks about bed bugs. And it also puts the cost of remediation for those bed bugs onto the tenant. And even if the tenant brings them in, we'll pass the cost on to the tenant if more than just the tenant's unit needs to be remediated. So if those bed bugs have traveled to the neighbor, you might be responsible for remedying that problem as well. So make sure that you understand that, because it's very expensive to get that dealt with, and it's not something typically that happens with just one visit by pest control. It typically has to be several. So make sure that you're aware of that bed bugs the cost of that could be passed on to you, even if the building takes care of other things like regular spraying for just ants or other pests. Okay, another quiz. So again, we're talking about what are acceptable rental practices. A, the landlord allows a tenant with a disability to transfer as long as they pay a $500 transfer fee. B, the landlord charges a move-in deposit and a monthly fee for pets. C, a tenant is experiencing pest problems and decides to withhold rent until the landlord addresses the issue. Or D, an apartment requires you to have your own account set up with outside companies for water, gas, and electric. So, which are acceptable? Yep. We're getting a lot of people saying B and D, and that's right. So B, the landlord charges a move-in deposit and a monthly fee for pets. That's completely legal and acceptable. And also D is as well. You know, they can ask you to set up, if there's separate meters for each apartment, they can require that you set up all those utilities in your own name. A is not legal if the person has asked for an accommodation to transfer units, then they should not have to pay a transfer fee. And never withhold your rent. I just want to make sure that. So C, the person is experiencing pest problems, so they withhold their rent. So in Texas, there's really never a reason that you can use to get away with withholding rent. You could have the ceiling falling in on you. You could have rampant mold. You could have rodent infestation. Like, there is no legal reason that you can use in Texas to withhold your rent. You're expected to pay rent. So never withhold rent for any reason. I just want to make sure that that's really clear. There's just really, you know, I know it sounds really unfair. A lot of people get really upset by that. But there really isn't any reason. There is no legal way that you can withhold your rent for any issue that's happening with your apartment. And if you do withhold your rent, you're probably going to get an eviction notice. And you don't want that, because you know, if you end up in eviction court, you could get something put on your record that will make it difficult for you to rent in the future. Okay. Another issue that you want to keep in mind when you're looking through the lease document is rental insurance. Some apartments now are requiring tenants to get rental insurance, and that's not going to cover any damage to the actual apartment. The rental insurance is for your own personal belongings. So say a pipe breaks and the apartment floods, the housing provider is the one that's going to have to pay for that plumbing and whatever other damage is done to the unit. But if all of your belongings get soaked, that's what you need your rental insurance for. The apartment is probably not going to compensate you for any of your property damage. So that's the purpose of rental insurance. Some apartments are requiring it now, and they want you to show proof of rental insurance. Some apartments now actually like get it for you. If you don't show that you've gotten it on your own and show the proof, they'll go ahead and add a fee to your monthly rent, because they'll have had their provider they'll have found a rental policy for you. So if it's required, you need to make sure that you get it. But just, you know, it's always even if it isn't required, just remember that it covers your personal belongings from damage, theft. So it's something that might give you peace of mind. So even if it isn't required, you still might want to consider it. And it's not illegal for housing providers to require that you have rental insurance. It's at their discretion. Okay, parking. So parking is a really big issue that we get tons of questions about as well. And there should be a section in your lease regarding parking. Some apartments will, you know, assign a parking space, and that's your space that comes with your unit. Some have a parking lot, but it's more of a first come, first serve. So you know, park wherever there's availability. There'll also be a towing policy in the lease. So if you know, for example, have assigned parking, but you park in somebody else's spot, they might tow you. Some apartments charge a monthly fee for parking, which is perfectly legal. Some will have an open free-for-all parking lot, but maybe they're charging a fee for covered parking. And that's perfectly legal as well. So parking is one of those things that, again, it's really at the discretion of the housing provider. So make sure that you review your lease for that item. And also, you know, for all of these things that I've discussed, if you have questions when you go to rent an apartment or single family home, whatever it is, any rental, you know, ask those questions up front. You know, if you're unsure, just ask. Make sure that you go in with a full understanding of what, your responsibilities are going to be living at that rental. Okay. Entry into your unit. So, people always, I think there's an assumption people have that they have to grant permission for the housing provider to enter their rental. And there actually is not any requirement like that in Texas. So you don't have an absolute right to not have a housing provider enter your unit unless you give permission. So they can enter your unit for any kind of repair or maintenance, for example, and they don't have to notify you that they're going to do it. Most of them will. They'll put a notice on your door or email you, whatever, through the portal, whatever, however they handle those types of issues where they give you notice, but they don't have to. And so I think people think they have that right to be notified, but you actually don't. You can ask for a notice. You can ask, when you first rent, could you please give me, 24-hour notice before you enter my unit? And they may or may not give you that, but you don't have a right to give that. And especially if it's an emergency kind of repair issue, like, that pipe that burst or sewage overflowing or anything like that, that has to be dealt with immediately. So whether you're home or not, they're going to enter your unit. So if you don't want them to do that, like I said, you need to request that you get notice, but again, you don't have any right to that. So if they don't agree with you, there's really nothing you could do to force them to give you notice. We get the question a lot of times with people who are renting single family homes, and maybe the owner now has decided they're not going to rent it anymore and they want to put it on the market and sell it. It creates a lot of tension between the renter and the owner because they need to show it in order, to prospective buyers. And if the two parties are not on the same page about that, it creates a lot of tension. But just understand, if you are renting a single family home, and the landlord now wants to show it because they're selling it, you can't tell them no, that they can't show the unit. And, try to come to an agreement with the owner about giving you some sort of notice, 24 hours, whatever, before somebody goes in, but they don't have to do that. And a lot of times when, realtors are showing people open houses, or, homes that are on the rental market, or on the homes that are for sale, they'll want to see them same day. So 24 hours might not be reasonable. So you need to work something out with the owner regarding that issue. Okay. So now let's talk about the end of a lease term. So you signed a 12-month lease and you're getting to the end. Make sure that you understand how much, if you don't want to continue living there, make sure that you understand how much notice you have to give to the housing provider that you're not going to renew. And it's either going to be 30 days or 60 days, and it should state that in your lease. So if you're not going to renew and you want to move, make sure you give the right notice, because if you are supposed to give 60 days and you only give 30, you're going to have to stay one more month. And whether you stay there or not, you're going to be responsible for paying rent for that additional 30 days, because the requirement was to give 60 days notice. So make sure that you look to see what that term is. And the housing provider as well should let you know 30 or 60 days before the lease is over if they're going to renew or not, if they want you to renew or not. So if they want you to renew, that's the time they're going to give you the terms, maybe an increased rent amount. Maybe they'll give you the opportunity to, pay one amount if you're going to sign another 12-month lease, and maybe an amount that's a little higher if you want to go month to month. But not all housing providers do offer the month to month anymore. Most of them want to lock you into a lease term. So also understand that you don't have an absolute right to renew the lease. So a landlord can decide for any reason accept discrimination, but for any reason, they could tell you they don't want to renew the lease. Maybe they want to get rid of you for whatever reason. And they don't have to tell you what that reason is, but they don't have to renew if they don't want to. The renewals of leases is at the discretion of the housing provider. The only exception to that is if you live in public housing. Public housing has different rules. And in public housing, there is an expectation of a lease renewal unless you've breached one of the terms of your lease, and then they don't have to. But those are very specific reasons that they don't have to renew your lease. So just make sure that you understand what the notice requirement is, and make sure that you follow that. Okay. I think probably in the top 5 questions that we get, it's related to security deposits and move out. So if you do decide you're going to move out, make sure again that you give the proper notice, but also once you've moved your belongings and cleaned the unit, take photos. And when you move in, take photos so that you have 2 sets of photos, one when you moved in and one when you moved out, so that you can compare that in case there's any discrepancies about repair issues after you've moved out, or things that the apartment says that you need to pay for, that they need to fix, for example. So you can ask for a walkthrough at move out, but it's not something that you can force them to give you because there's no legal requirement that they have to do that. But you know, you can ask the manager to whoever, to the owner, to walk through the unit when you move, so that you agree on what the condition of the unit is when you leave. But again, take those photos because those are going to be really important when it comes to the security deposit. So the security deposit, again, that's going to be an item in your lease. And so when you move out, the housing provider has 30 days to either give you an itemization of what they used your deposit for, so for any kind of damages, for example, or to send you your deposit back, or a combination of the two. Maybe they used half your deposit for something and they're returning half of it. But they need to give that to you within 30 days. Now the 30-day clock starts when you move out, but you also, for that 30-day clock to start, you have to give them a forwarding address, so that they know where they can send the notice of what they've used your deposit for, or the refund. So just make sure, keep that in mind. A lot of times we have people who move out under bad circumstances and they don't want the housing provider to know where they live, but you need to give something. You need to give some forwarding address for where they should send documents, to security deposit documents back to you. So just keep that in mind. If you do have a bad relationship with your housing provider, you can always give them our address and they could tell them they could send everything to us, and we'll make sure that you get whatever they send. Okay, more best practice quiz. So again, what's acceptable? A, the landlord advises that they will take care of the move out inspection and the tenant does not need to be present. B, the landlord keeps the entirety of a tenant's security deposit. C, a tenant has asked the landlord for repeated repairs during their stay. The landlord decides not to renew their lease at the end of its term. And D, the maintenance team does a planned safety inspection of a unit while the tenant is not present. So what's acceptable here? So this one's a little bit tricky. So A, the landlord advises that they will take care of the move out inspection and the tenant does not need to be present. So there's nothing illegal about that. It's acceptable, but it's something that we don't advise you to not be there. You know, if there's going to be a move out inspection, make sure that you're there. What about B? The landlord keeps the entirety of a tenant's security deposit. If they can justify why they've done that, there's nothing illegal about that. So maybe your security deposit was $250. They used $125 to fix a broken door and the other $125 to do a basic cleaning. As long as they give you a list of what they use the money for, they could keep your entire security deposit. They just can't keep it and not show documentation of what they've used it for. So that's a little bit of a tricky one too. What about C? A tenant has asked the landlord for repeated repairs, and then the landlord says, I'm not going to renew the lease. So, that sounds like retaliation, but retaliation is one of those things that it's hard to prove without any kind of documentation. And as the tenant, you may have the sense that you're not getting renewed because you have asked for a lot of repairs during your 12-month lease. But if it's going to be, these are things that are really difficult to prove. So, this is not acceptable for them to do. But it may be really hard for you to get any kind of resolution with that. And then D, the maintenance team does a planned safety inspection of a unit while the tenant is not present. That's completely reasonable. They can do that without your presence. But again, like I said, you can ask them at the beginning of your lease, if you're going to need to enter my unit for any reason, could you let me know 24 hours in advance, because I'd like to be present if you ever enter my unit. And that's a perfectly reasonable request, but again, they don't have to grant it if they don't have to agree with it if they don't want to. So make sure to protect yourself and read through the lease document before you sign. And like I said, ask questions. If you have questions about things, even if you missed it in the lease, ask questions, and they'll either tell you or point it out in the document where the explanation is of that particular issue. If you have concerns, don't sign it. And if you have questions, you can ask, like I said, you could ask the leasing agent, or you can call us and ask us if you have questions. So one of the things before I turn it back over to Marty that I wanted to say is, I've talked a lot about how a lot of these things are in the lease, and there isn't a lot of law in Texas that guides landlord-tenant relationships. So the leases, that is what makes the lease really important. But if we want more tenant protections in Texas, then we need to be active voters. We need to vote in people who care about landlord-tenant issues, because right now the majority of legislators in Austin, this isn't a priority for them. And so every time there's any kind of proposed legislation that would assist the tenants, it most times doesn't even get out of committee so it can be voted on. So it's killed in committee. So if we want these things to make it out of committee and get a vote, or we want them to pass, then we need to be more active as voters and vote in people who also care about these issues. And that's the only way really that we're going to make sure that's the only way that we're going to get more laws on the books in Texas that are specific to the landlord-tenant relationship, or that are protective of tenants' rights. Because Texas is a very property ownership biased state. And so, we need to be more active if we want those things to change. So that was just me on my soapbox.
That's such an important point, because, when you talk about lobbying in Texas, the Texas Apartment Association is quite the powerhouse, because all their members are apartment owners, usually, or management companies, and they have money. And so that they have the money to do a lot of lobbying. And unfortunately, it's going to take a pretty good grassroots effort in Texas to really kind of balance the scales of landlord or tenant-friendly laws in Texas, because it is definitely a landlord-friendly state. So that's a very, very important point. I'm going to give Francis a minute or two to look through the chat and the Q&A, but while she's doing that, I'm going to talk once again about the CEUs. For those of you that are joining us today looking for CEUs, we are set up to provide CEUs for licensed social workers and licensed professional counselors in the state of Texas. If you have a different license in Texas, or you have a license outside of Texas, you're more than welcome to go through the process, get a certificate, submit it to the jurisdiction you're required to report to, and but just know that that's up to them whether they accept that or not. For attending today's webinar, either for CEUs or for a certificate of attendance, it's worth 1.5 hours of CEU credits. You must complete the entire live webinar and Q&A in order to qualify. You must also complete the Google survey that should pop up for you as you try to close out today. It should give you an option to go to that survey as you close out a Zoom. But if you don't get that, some companies have pop-up blockers, all sorts of things. You will receive that also in a email, follow-up email later today from me. The survey will be up and available to you for till 5 p.m. on the 7th. I've added an extra day because of the holidays to get that done. And then please give me about 3 weeks after that to get all those certificates out to you all. And as I said before, I kind of go back and forth between getting all caught up and then get behind again. And I'm behind a little bit right now, but we will get caught up. But you will get the certificates. And if you don't get them within the 3 weeks, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to look into it. Francis, do you want to advance the slide one more time?
And I do, there are a few questions, so I can go over
Yes,
those.
yes. I just want to leave this up. This is our next webinar we're doing with Francis in July. But go ahead, Francis.
Okay, so somebody asked if a tenant has issues with the lease agreement and bed bugs, should they call for housing, code enforcement, or legal aid? So there is a process somebody could follow to get these things remedied, but it's really hard to force the housing provider to do. There's really no agency that can force them to do that. Code enforcement won't deal with bed bugs. Code enforcement looks at, things that are out of code compliance, and there's no provisions usually in city codes related to bed bugs. So code enforcement won't do anything. But legal aid would be an agency to call to ask if there's, what the process is to try to at least get the housing provider to deal with the bed bugs. And a lot of that is going to be, writing a formal letter, making sure that it's sent certified so you get a receipt. But even it doesn't force them to do it. And ultimately the person, might need to take them to small claims court or justice of the peace court to get that remedied. But there's a process to follow before that. And one of those things, is writing that formal letter and getting it sent certified mail. So you have documentation that you've requested for these things to be dealt with.
Francis, I know you talked about code enforcement, but does the health department do anything either on the city or county level? Do they have anything to do with bed bugs?
They don't. The health department doesn't either. I know they'll, if there's like a rodent infestation, they'll go look at it, but bed bugs, no, they don't deal with that. They won't deal with like a roach infestation, for example. I think people assume too that the health department is going to be the place you report mold issues, and health department won't deal with that either. If you have mold issues, you can call code enforcement, but my experience with them has been they kind of, it's like a tennis ball issue, and they lob it back to health department lobs it back to them, because mold is one of those issues that really isn't addressed in any code. So.
And that again is going to take some advocacy work at a grassroots level. And that means every one of you that's on here, just so you know, it's just going to take everybody that possibly can to contact your elected representatives and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So next question, do lease documents come in Spanish? Do management companies provide lease info for Spanish speakers or any other language? Are there any laws regarding this? So there are no laws in Texas regarding this. And the landlords are not required to put documentation like leases and notices. They're not required to do it in any other language other than English. So there really isn't any, there's no law that requires them to do that. So if they're providing a lease in Spanish, they're doing it completely voluntarily because they're trying to, you know, address the needs of the population that they serve. But I actually haven't myself seen any leases in Spanish here in Texas. I did a lot of this work in California, and we would see leases in other languages. You know, it wasn't common either, but we would see them, and I just haven't seen any here. So I'm not sure that, I don't know if any housing providers are offering any lease documents or anything like that in Spanish or other languages other than English. Okay.
Jennifer, thanks for your comment. I would imagine that that it may vary a little bit by city or county, but that's great that that the code enforcement got somebody to react. That's good.
Okay, so somebody asked if there's a link to download the slides. Marty sent that out, I think, before the presentation, but he also sends it again after.
It will go out in the follow-up email, and I've put it in the chat a few times, and I'll put it in the chat again right now for you. There is the link for the slides.
So somebody said, wouldn't you need flood insurance for a scenario like that? And I'm not sure what they're talking about, but flood insurance, not for like a broken pipe that floods. Flood insurance is typically for like a natural disaster sort of flood.
Right.
But renter's insurance should cover your belongings if there's like a issue related to the rental that caused the flood, like broken pipes or, you know, backed up sewage or whatever.
I think
or leaky roof.
Yeah, leaky roof. I think it's if it comes from rivers or streams or that kind of thing, that it requires flood insurance. But if it comes like you said, you know, the leaky pipes or that kind of thing, that's a different animal altogether.
Okay. Somebody said they have specific questions regarding 811 project rental assistance demonstration lease, supportive housing for persons with disabilities, specifically with unit inspections. How can we get the reasonable and specific requirements of the tenant for inspections? I don't know 811 projects.
811 is done through the state. If you will, I'm trying to see who has that on here. If you reach out to me, I'll try to get you in contact or get you the answers to your questions. The 811 program in Texas is all through the state. There were two different 811 programs. There was an old 811 program that was bricks and mortar. There's still some of those out there, not a lot. I know Plano Community Homes has some 811 units still that from the old 811. But the new 811 is actually managed by the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. They do that as a voucher program. And if you'll reach out to me directly, whoever has that question, I apologize, I still have missed it. Reach out to me directly, and I'll try to get that for you.
This person has another question. It's the same person about interim inspections, interim recertification. I'm assuming that comes like midway through. I'm not sure what kind of housing they're talking about there, so that might be something. Janet Taylor asked that question. If you could reach out to Marty about it.
Yeah, you'll get my follow-up email after this, and if you'll just reply back to me, I'll try to get your answers, your question answered. Spencer, God, what's Spencer's last name? That's terrible. Spencer, with the state of Texas, TDHCA, we've had him even do presentations before several times on 811, and it's been a while. It may be time to do another one of those, but we'll get that answered. Anything, did you see anything else there?
I think
Um,
Janet Taylor has a lot of follow-up questions, but I think relate, I don't really know 811 housing. So
Yeah, yeah.
Janet, reach out to Marty.
Yeah, I've got you there, Jan. If you just reach
And
out to me.
I think I got everything. Somebody said they were able to get code enforcement on the issue of bed bugs. So that's
Yes,
good.
yeah,
Because they can just ignore you if they want, because it really isn't a code issue. Like there's no, because code compliance works under whatever is in the code for that particular city. And typically bed bug, there's not a code related to bed bugs. So it's great that you were able to get somebody out.
yeah. I saw that Kim, and you may have already answered this, talked about probably not getting her deposit back because she's been in the same unit for 8 years. That has nothing to do with getting a deposit back. 8 years, if they have to replace the carpet, unless it's a reason that's in normal wear and tear in an apartment is included in your rent. So your deposit shouldn't be held back from you for taking care of normal wear and tear of someone living in an apartment for 8 years. And so they still will be required to give you documentation or at least give you notice of what they've used your deposit for. And replacing carpet in an apartment you've been in for 8 years, I would think that would be pretty marginal for them to be able to come back and keep your deposit for the carpet, unless of course, you've had animals that have torn it up or there's some other reason why they're having to change it other than it just being old and having lived its life cycle.
So that's right. And if in any deposit related issues, if you feel that, they shouldn't have kept your deposit for things that, you shouldn't have been responsible for. The remedy there is to go to Justice of the Peace Court and do a small claims action to get your deposit back. And if your deposit wasn't, like, for example, if you didn't get anything and nor notice that of what they used it on after 30 days, you could actually bring a small claims action to get 3 times your deposit back if the housing provider didn't follow the 30-day rule.
Very good, very good. And Janet, again, please get with me on 811. We will talk about that, and then if I need to get you some more information, we'll do that. Francis, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Marty, for organizing everything. We had a really good turnout today. Thank you, everyone, who attended.
Thank you all for joining us. And I know we got done early, but we got through all the information and great. You get about 35 minutes of your life back. Extra, you get a double up on 35 minutes of your life. Okay, Francis, thank you so very much. Thank you all so very much. You all have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.